Hi, folks. We are continuing on with the New Deal. The first half of the New Deal is relief. Try and give immediate relief to people. The second half, which we'll continue with next time, is reform. That is changing the basic structure of the country. FDR's goal was never to destroy capitalism, to institute even socialism, to institute communism, absolutely not, but to save capitalism. And how do you do that? The question, of course, is still the question today. How big should government be? What should government be responsible for? So when he does the bank holiday, what Roosevelt is doing is using the government not to nationalize the banks like most European countries have. They have a national bank that's owned by the government, but we don't have that. We have individual banks. Franklin Roosevelt used government money to save private banks. After they were sound and whole again, that was the end of government interference, except for regulation that they don't gamble on the stock market. So the question, of course, with all of this is how big should government be? We're again working with slides 26 through 31 here. So he has a bank holiday. He does the fireside chats, several chats a week on a regular basis. And then the first agency he had to create was FERA, Federal Emergency Relief Administration. Today, the equivalent would be FEMA, I think. This had not been done before, certainly not on a federal level. Most relief was local, if it was there at all. So Franklin Roosevelt takes $500 million, which is a chunk of money at that point, and he gives it directly to the states to hand out for immediate food aid, not for anything else, but for food aid. So within weeks, you have 50 states sending representatives to Washington to collect money. And this was done incredibly quickly. His guy in charge of this was a little chain-smoking, emaciated guy called Harry Hopkins, who started out, he didn't even have an office. He had a table, he had a desk and a chair, not even a desk, a table in a hallway in Washington. So overnight, he gets a staff together, he gets people together, and in the first 2 days he was sitting at that table in the hallway, he dispensed $20 million. His file cabinet was a bunch of packing crates. In the first year, it didn't stop with 500 million. In the first year, $5 billion in food aid was handed out. Why? Because people are literally starving to death in the 1930s. In some counties, in some states, 80% are on relief. They have no income whatsoever, particularly in the Rust Belt in the old industrial Midwest and New England states. Okay, people would come in from different states. The Secretary of State of Texas would travel to Washington and he'd say, I have 40 counties in Northwest Texas in the middle of the Dust Bowl. They have absolutely nothing. Harry Hopkins would say, how much money do you want? He'd say, well, let's see, $2 million. Harry Hopkins would write a check and say, here it is, go, next one. And he handed out overnight millions of dollars. But the result was people stopped starving to death. At least there was food. These agents went back to their states. They went to the counties. The county agents went out and bought flour. They bought sugar. They bought beans. They bought basic food supplies, sat on the courthouse steps, and people came up and got a bag of flour or a bag of beans or a bag of whatever. And the starvation, death by starvation, slowly disappears from death certificates. The second agency he creates, think about how big is big government, was the NRA. And this was the National Recovery Administration. We have an equivalent today. It's not really a named agency, but the Coronavirus Committee is kind of doing this. This is big government, absolutely. This is direct government control of businesses. And the question here is socialism, capitalism, communism, where does it fall, or all three? The goal was to stabilize the economy, to stop businesses from failing. This should sound familiar. This was highly controversial. It passed in Congress with a much narrower margin. FERA, they had no problem with. Emergency relief, we got that. What this did was sent government agents out into private businesses, into companies, and these agents would set the minimum wage, which at that time was $12 for a 40-hour week. It would set the prices at which things were sold. It would set the quantities that you could produce in your factory, the hours that your workers would work, the quality of the products, and the working conditions that the workers would be working under. This is direct government control of private businesses, no question about it. Their symbol, the Blue Eagle, which is in your book and also on the slides. And underneath the Blue Eagle is a little phrase. The motto of the NRA was, "We do our part." Now, here's the catch. You didn't have to do this. You signed on voluntarily. Companies would sign on voluntarily. Chevy Motor Company, huge car company, agreed and signed on. Ford refused. Ford also paid incredibly good wages and said, we don't need this. So it was voluntary on the part of the company. But once you signed on, government agent would come into your company and control everything in the company. Huge PR campaign. So there's a lot of public pressure here to patronize Blue Eagle stores and buy Blue Eagle products. So if you're in the 1930s, you would be more likely to buy a Chevy than a Ford, for example. This controlled everything from huge coal mines and car companies down to shoeshine boys and little mom and pop stores on the corner. So it lasted slightly under 2 years. And you can see some of the problems with this. First of all, how do you enforce this? Some guy can come in and set up the criteria, but then unless he's there 24 hours a day, all kinds of ways to get around it. The other big problem with it, not everybody signed on, not everybody was forced to sign on. So let's say you own a donut shop and you are selling your donuts for 10 cents a piece. Government comes in and says, okay, we want you to make 800 donuts a day. We want you to sell them for 7 cents a piece. You pay your workers this much. They have this many sprinkles on them, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? You agree to do that. You put a Blue Eagle in your window. People are happy to come and buy from you because you're helping support the effort with Blue Eagle. Okay? The guy down the block, unfortunately, is not participating in the NRA, and he doesn't have a Blue Eagle in his window. He can sell his donuts for 5 cents a piece. So in the middle of the Depression, when people don't have money, they're going to buy the 5-cent donuts. So basically, the whole system collapsed, hard to enforce, also undercutting. Because everybody didn't belong, the people who didn't belong could go underneath the people who did, who could sell it for less. The third agency, as Franklin Roosevelt said, our greatest primary task is to put people to work. You've got to help people. People want to work. You've got to create jobs for them because there are no jobs available. Okay, so these were all work projects, and there were a number of them. The first one on the list, I think, is the PWA, the Public Works Administration. These were adult men. They built public buildings in small towns and communities across America. The agency spent $3.3 billion, and over the years that it existed, hired 4 million men. These are basically infrastructure projects. Some of the things they built were town halls, bridges, seaports, courthouses, zoos, 600 airports, 30,000 schools, 70% of the schools in America by 1940, playgrounds, 250,000 miles of roads. In New York City, the Triborough Bridge, the Key West Highway, Boulder Dam in Nevada, the New York to District of Columbia Railway, things that we don't even think about. These were all PWA projects. The goal is get people working, give them a salary so they can support their families. The amazing thing with all of these, almost all of these public works projects and the food aid being handed out, from what we know, there was almost no fraud. They were done honestly, people were desperate, and there was almost no ripping off the government and disappearing with the money. Franklin Roosevelt's favorite program was the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. Get a hashtag for the key word on each of these. PWA, Public Works, Civilian Conservation is the hashtag for this one. And this was his favorite program. He really kept close track of what was going on in the CCC. Public Works Administration, we have buildings all over Austin, including our old courthouse, including dozens of buildings downtown that were built by the PWA. CCC was a little bit different. It employed young men. There were a couple thousand women, but almost all young males of any race, any color, to basically do conservation projects. There were 1,300 camps. You applied and you stayed in the camps for 2 years. They employed, over the time of its existence, 2.5 million young males. And you got paid $1 a day, $30 a month. Here's the catch. You had to mail $25 back home to your family. So really, you only got to keep $5. Government control? Absolutely. What are they doing? They are doing conservation projects. You lived in a barracks. You were provided your room and board, and you were paid $30 a month, but $25 went back home. They did erosion projects. They graded land. They built 5 million erosion dams. They planted 2 billion trees, a lot of them on the plains, again on the theory that rain is going to come where there's vegetation. 46,000 bridges, 18,000 miles of trees on the plains. Most national park and national forest structures that we have today were built by the CCC. All of our infrastructure, including, if you ever go to Bastrop State Park, almost all of those older buildings at Bastrop State Park were built by the CCC, and they have plaques on them showing that. In the beginning, they mixed all races together in these barracks that they lived in. In the South, that didn't work out for obvious reasons, and pretty soon they had separate camps in the South for blacks and whites, young men. So the rest of the country was mixed. So this is really radical because for the first time you have mixed race people actually in very close contact sitting in the next bun. You had blacks, whites, you had Native Americans, you had Orientals. Anybody who walked in who needed a job, a young male, was given a job immediately. The question, of course, another question here is, why don't we do this today if people were out of work? I have done this kind of work. I've shoveled gravel. I have planted trees with the Forest Service, paid for my graduate school. I was happy to get the job. It's not quite that easy today. We don't build roads by putting 100 guys on a gang and shoveling gravel and tearing down and leveling land. We use machinery, and that takes training. It takes money. It's much harder to adapt this program today. But we still do this in national service and in national parks and national forest work. Can it be done today? A lot harder to do, but possibly. It's one solution for unemployed people. Okay, I will finish up the direct relief programs, particularly with the WPA next time, and move on into reform, which is the long-term programs that stayed long after the New Deal, which we don't even think about today, such as Social Security. So Franklin Roosevelt's goal is not only immediate relief, but to change American society, change American government. And again, this is something, we don't even think about these agencies today, but they didn't exist before 1932. We'll see you next time.